I can, yes.
All right, fine. Oh, got it. I've got to click got it. It's come up on my screen. Right. Right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give the talk. It's somewhat eclectic, and it's an overview of the Highlands and Islands and Ireland and Western Scotland that many of you may not be aware of. So it's quite interesting. Prehistory slides into history and merges with the modern, and the start and stop of named periods are vague, and they meld into each other. And for many years, the Dark Ages was thought of as a very well, Dark Ages, we knew little about it. We only knew from archaeology. There's not much in the way of historical records, but modern forensic archaeology has actually put a very different light on a lot of what went on from the times the Romans left us to the later Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages have been filled in a great deal. Based around Columba and his times, I explore some of the history. So we'll start there. The written history is difficult in a way, because the biggest life of Columba was written by a later bishop 100 years later, Adamnan, and it's really a hagiography, which is history but coloured by religious colorations, biases. So it needs to be sort of teased out a bit. And a lot of the pictures of Columba over the years have been what I call very romanticized. So we'll go from there. To start with, we'll go down with some, oops, why does that not go down? Page down? Hang on, I can't be on the right page. There we go. So Iona is off the bottom end of Mull in the Inner Hebrides. There's a note on here. There's a number of things in the talk that are copyright. I've generally left the copyright on the screen. It's just that it shouldn't be used commercially, that's all. It's fine for private information. So you get to Iona these days from Finnafort down here by ferry. The abbey's here. We'll zoom into 1 to 25,000. So there's the abbey complex there with a new youth centre above it. There's the village down there, and there's a nunnery. The current monastery is Benedictine. It was built in approximately 1200 and actually funded by a Viking called Ragnar. So it's quite interesting. The Vikings ravaged it in the 900s, and then they actually built and funded the building of the Benedictine monastery in 1200. And shortly afterwards, there's a nunnery which was down at the other end of the island. That's a aerial view. There's the abbey. That's the youth centre, and the nunnery's down here. This is a 1769 estate plan of the what was the village. There's no real road in the village. I sort of move this chat window off. Let's move the chat window over there. There's the nunnery. There was basically one street running down the centre, and these houses, there's no street shown around the houses at all, although presumably this track came down to the jetty. There must have been some sort of jetty down there. It was oh, right, page down. Right, so that's what the abbey looked like in 1800. It was in complete ruins. It had been gradually going into ruination over the 1600s after the Reformation, and it was basically just a shell in 1800. In the late 1890s, the owners, Campbell's, funded the recovering of the abbey itself. And then in the 1938, George Mcleod, who was minister in Glasgow, and he came from quite a high-flying Church of Scotland family. They'd been moderators. Most of his family had been moderators of the Church of Scotland. And he worked in the poor areas, governed areas of Glasgow, and there was a lot of unemployment in the 30s, and he brought unemployed workers up to do it up, and he kept appealing for money and for funds for doing it up. And gradually over the next 30 years, it got built up like this. So it is now a modern complex. The where we used to live was there. That's the old abbot's house. That was our bedroom window just over there, if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor?
Just about.
Just about. So on the left, the building on the left. This is looking from Torab, which is where they think Columba's cell was. That's this, where this stone with the rectangular cutout is, where they think there was a cross at one point in time. And that the little building in the middle there is what they call Columba's Shrine, where they believe Columba, under that, Columba was buried. But so who was Columba, and why is Iona so important? Well, Columba lived from 521 to 597. He was a great grandson of Neil, 5th century Irish High King, and he was related to several princes then reigning in Ireland, and early Dalriada. Now, Dalriada is spelt in various ways, but it's basically most of what is now Argyll. He was at the centre of a very bloody battle, which we'll come on to later, and founded a monastery in Iona that became a beacon of civilization in the early Middle Ages. He was even said to have successfully rebuked the Loch Ness monster, who went back down under the loch. Poet, scribe, politician, kingmaker, warrior, and holy man who became notorious. And I think his outspoken nature in a very non-PC way can be seen. Abbot Adaman, his biographer, he said that Columba banned cows from Iona because where there is a cow, there is a woman, and where there is a woman, there is trouble. So he was an interesting character. His exploits and the community he formed resulted in Iona becoming the burial place for 48 kings of Scotland, 4 Irish kings, 8 Norwegian kings, 2 French kings, and many Scottish clan chiefs. And most recently, 1994, the Labour leader John Smith was buried in the small graveyard of the Raleigh Goran. We'll come on to that later. There's a very nice museum there now that Historic Scotland have done up, and well lit, but you have to pay to enter, with a lot of the gravestones and things that were from the Raleigh Goran. But let's put it into some sort of context. I can't see all of this now. I've got all sorts of things sitting on top of my screen here. Looking at some of the prehistory around the Highlands and Islands, we've got in Shetland a village, farmstead, not village, but a farmstead, dates around 2200 BCE. They're radiocarbon corrected dates. The stones of Stenness in Orkney dates to about 3400 BCE and is actually the earliest recorded, well, I believe it is the earliest recorded monument of that sort in the UK. Maze House, also on Orkney, quite close by, was about 3000. Shortly afterwards, Callanish standing stones in Lewis were erected. I did some work with there's an Oxford professor some years ago, Professor Alexander Thom, who did a lot of work on how many of these standing circles were used as calendars and for predicting equinoxes and solstices, with alignments of the sun and the moon and hills in the distance. And he's written a couple of books which are really interesting. There's quite a lot of dispute about whether he was right or not, but it does seem to work quite well. St Kilda and Udall, there's Bronze Age and earlier evidence. I found this site in Mingulay, but there's a bit of Iron Age around most of the islands. The earliest Paleolithic evidence has been found that I know of is in the island of Islay, which is here, which is just north of Northern Ireland, which dates right at the start of the Paleolithic, just after the ice has gone back, really, at about 9,500 BC, and it's just a sort of camping site. So that's sort of putting it into context. Now, Callanish at the top here, 2,900, 2,600, predates Stonehenge. So there was a lot going on up here despite the remoteness. On Iona itself, there is not much evidence of early settlement. There's been quite a scatter of lithics found across the island. The ones on the left here have been found on various sites for development when houses or extensions are planned. They generally put an archaeological requirement on investigation. So that's pulled up quite a lot of these flints and similar lithics. And the National Trust for Scotland relatively recently found a Bronze Age midden site on the west of the island. The island has never had a rubbish, I mean, obviously not in the Bronze Age, but even until very recently didn't have a regular rubbish service. So the islanders were still using local dump sites back until the 1960s. So there's quite a lot of that on the island. But so we've got evidence from the Mesolithic at least through to the Bronze Age and Iron Age, limited evidence on Iona. Other sites in the area, the Iona's there on the bottom end of Mull on the left-hand side, top island. I don't think my cursor's working very well here. At the bottom end of Mull, that's from Argyll Archaeology Unit, showing the earlier sites. And the right-hand map is a scatter of Iron Age sites. Iron Age in Scotland it's later than in England. It spans a big range from 500 or 600 AD right through to 500 or 600, sorry, BC through to 500 or 600 AD, maybe even 700 and 800. It sort of morphed. It's very difficult with pottery. The pottery really didn't change much from the Bronze Age through to the late medieval. People were using local clay sources and so on to make pottery, and it is actually surprisingly difficult unless it's imported pottery to date it using pottery, other than using fluorescence, scientific techniques to look up when it was baked. I've put this in. We'll get to some archaeology, I promise. Looking at genetics. The left-hand one is UK Oxford University results of a study looking at genetics. The southeast of England, or half of England, has got an awful lot of French and German DNA in the samples they take. Northern Ireland and Scotland, the area we're looking in here, which is where I've got a lot of my DNA, is actually quite a specific area, and it's quite tightly located. There was a study, I don't know if people saw it before Christmas, that was widely put in the press, that all over the UK, we should all have about 30 or 40% German DNA. It was a multinational study, but actually there's no evidence of it in the DNA analyses I've seen for Irish and Scottish people. It certainly would match where the Saxons had a big area, but in fact it doesn't seem to have come up the West Coast. Now, one of the things that hasn't been really known much about until recently was in AD 535 to 539, there was a very severe and protracted short-term cooling due to extensive atmospheric volcanic dust blocking out the sun's energy. The effects were widespread. They caused crop failures, famines worldwide, followed by widespread pagan dynasties collapsing across the world. And in Europe, by about 600 AD CE, about a third of the population of Europe had died out between 535 and 600 due to famine and due to plague. And this has really only been recognized in the past 20 or 25 years. And a lot of the work is in the last 15 years. It's really quite interesting. The graphs at the top right show the two of the many, but the better analyses of what the temperature was. Temperature changes were from tree ring and other growth resources and carbon analysis resources. And you'll see at about 536, there was where the darker blue coloring is, there was a really significant drop of 2 to 3 degrees. It wasn't just a temperature drop, but it was also a sunlight drop. And in the records, there are lots of notes of severe famines. And within a few years, the first really that we know about, one of the first major plagues, the Justinian plague, took root. And the map in the background shows the dates where there were recorded outbreaks of the Justinian plague. It reached Ireland in 544 and again in 576. It missed out Scotland. The only recorded outbreak of this particular plague in Scotland was a very minor one on the outskirts of Edinburgh in the Lothians, but it never seemed to reach the bulk of Scotland, which is one of the reasons I'll come to as to why Columba and his people moved from Northern Ireland to Scotland. The plague was really, given our COVID epidemic at the moment, the plague was really quite dramatic. It rolled on for almost 200 years. Not in our area, it was more like 100 years, 150 years in Britain and Western Europe, but down in Asia Minor, it carried on right up to the late 780s. And it was really quite devastating. In Ireland, the old pagan gods were seen as having failed the people, and Christianity took over to give a new hope. Christianity had already been introduced, and there was quite a lot of disagreement about changing religion and changing belief systems. But within a generation of this climate disaster, most of the monasteries that gave rise to the what's called the golden age of Irish Christianity were in existence. And you'll see, if I can't see it, if I move my thing here, if you look at the dates, there's monastery after monastery, year after year, from 537 were being created by Columba, Columcille. Sometimes Columcille is written as one word, and sometimes it's written as two words. I'm not consistent in the piece because it's not consistent in the literature. And by then 544, we get this sporadic outbreaks of the plague occurring, which went on for about 15 years in Ireland at that point, and then it came back again later. Going through to about 554, Abbey of Kells, which was one of Columba's monasteries that King Dermot had given him land for north west of Dublin. And the Book of Kells, later in time, was believed to be written on Iona, but it went to Kells for safekeeping because of the Vikings. I've lost. Sorry. Right. So we've got two maps here. We've got. I haven't changed the dates on them. They're actually more contemporaneous than they say on the headings. The left-hand map shows all the monasteries that sprung up between 540 and 650. They're all monasteries, all those name markers on the left-hand map. The colours are different tribes, but the tribes aren't as clear as that. There's overlords and under tribes, and it was there were battles going on a lot of the time. A lot of them were petty fights that didn't result in many deaths, but they were always going over territory, and particularly when famine and shortages of food was around, that made it worse. Now, Columba, so the right-hand map is where it had settled down a bit. They say up to 950, but in fact, I would have said this is closer to 650, 700, apart from some of the Viking stuff near Dublin, the green colouring. The Northern Uneal, Columba was of the family of the Northern Uneal, and the Southern Uneal included Tara, you can see just west of Dublin, which was where the High King was of Ireland. So he was well connected. And then the top right-hand side of Ireland, nearest Scotland, you can see is Dalriata. It's spelt that way there, Dalriada. And that was where that was a Uneal stronghold. And by about 500, there was already quite a lot of them had moved into Scotland. And this increased greatly after the plague hit. Now, there's two reasons. Why did Columba go to Iona? The first one that's all throughout the literature, and it's a popularized one, especially by the churches, is that he copied somebody else's Latin Psalter. And it was Finian claimed that he hadn't given him permission, and Columba had copied this in the dark at night with mystical light for it, and he took it to King Dermot for judgment, who said, no, it belongs to Finian. To every cow belongs a calf, and therefore to every book belongs its copy. It's sometimes claimed that's the first copyright dispute, but it wasn't really copyright because Finian hadn't written it as such. It was already a copy of a Psalter. So anyway, that was what it was about, and they then said there was a big fight about it. It resulted in 3,000 men being killed, and Columba was ordered out of Ireland to go and convert other people because of all the ones that had been killed in battle. Interestingly, the surviving pages of the book that's believed to have been the one in question has now been dated to about 600, which is about 50, 60 years after the actual battle. So it's a bit dubious. The second one, which I think is much more likely, is because of the famines and the plague in Ireland and the strife had increased, and Western Scotland hadn't got the plague. And the Annals of Tigernach record Cernan, son of Aed, king of Connaught, was taking sanctuary in a monastery of Columba's, but King Dermot attacked the monastery and pulled the person out and executed him. And that caused a really violent clash. And in revenge, the Uneal attacked Dermot's men at a battle of Kildrain, which is the same battle as referred to in the Psalter explanation, resulting in the death of 3,000 approximately of Dermot's men. And so he then went off to Scotland. But in fact, the thought is that probably actually as much often as that, he went over to support his family, because we'll look at the family in Dalriada in a minute. So they set off from Iona with 12 brothers. Well, they weren't brothers, but 12 comrades to found Iona, and but also to provide support for the Uneal settlements in Dalriada. And Adaman, he was the abbot of Iona 100 years later, claims that Aidan was ordained as king of Dalriada by Columba, which is the first example of an ordination of a king known in Britain and Ireland. So there was a lot of politics going on to do with this. So there we've got Ireland on the left, with Dalriada at the top, and then on the right-hand map we've got the various clans of the Uneals, and there were 4 of them there that were active. Well, 5 of them effectively, but four main ones and a small one, who were all related to each other and had all got like minor kingship of their areas, and they were holding off against the Picts, which were further over in Scotland. So this was really an extension of the Uneal territory into Scotland, and Iona sort of gave it a religious substance, with another royal person being based on Iona. So he comes to Iona. We don't know what what the early monastery looked like. The top right is a typical beehive monk dwelling from Ireland, but there's no evidence of anything like this on Iona. Now, it's possible that there were some built like this, although there's not a lot of stone that could have been used. If there were, then they will be in the foundations of the current Benedictine Abbey. There's certainly nothing been found like that, no remains, no foundations or anything that look as if that was what they were. So it was almost certainly more like a typical Iron Age hutment, with either a few stones for walls or wood and daub for walls, and a heather and reed roof. And they are typical of the age, both in Ireland for monasteries. So you think of a monastery, you think, oh gosh, there's buildings, but actually all those monasteries in Ireland were mainly collections of huts at this time, 500, 600 AD. One of the people that sailed with Columba to Iona was somebody called Otto or Otterin or Villigorin, or St. Oran, and he was the eldest of the monks that came with Columba to Ireland, and that's his cross. And it's in there was a chapel put up in later years, and that's where all the kings have been buried and all the leaders of the clans were buried, and that's St. Oran's chapel there on the right. Now he was the oldest monk, and there's a really odd story that Columba, when they tried to build the church, first build the church on Iona, it kept collapsing, and Columba had a dream where he found that he needed a sacrifice under the church to bless it, to give it a foundation sacrifice. And apparently Oran agreed to be buried alive there. And then the church didn't fall down, but 3 days later he popped back up out of the ground saying, God's not as we imagine him, and there's no hell and nothing like heaven. And so Columba said, I'll hurry up and bury him again and take him and put him outside. So that was why the Relegoran is meant to be that far away from where the monastery site is. And there's quite a lot of stories both in the Hebrides and in Ireland around that. Also on this slide is an approximate, it's a starting list of the kings that are buried in the Relegoran on Iona from the first one, Ecgric at 685 AD, and you'll see that they were all buried out there. It had become a really important place that for kings, for the royals to be buried, and that went right the way through into the Middle Ages, and it actually goes through to about 1400. But I stopped here at Macbeth, so it goes right the way through to Duncan and Macbeth, who are both recorded as being buried in the Relegoran on Iona. It's never been excavated because it's still consecrated ground, so other areas have. So now we come to a bit of archaeology for a change. This is one of Peter Fowler's sketches put on top of aerial view of the site. So we can see the abbey there, the existing Benedictine abbey, modernized. Tor Ab is where it was thought that Columba had his cell. There's a big flat stone in this field up here where it says area of early monastic cells, where it was said that the brothers, the monks, ate. That was their table where they put all their food out. But actually nothing has been found at all in either of these two fields here. There's a field barrier there, or there was. It has been excavated, it has been geophysicsed. There is really no evidence of huts or anything else in that area. So quite honestly, it's probably not a true story. The vallum is just an earth bank, which we'll look at later with some of the archaeology that ran around the site. To go on to the next one. The excavations at Tor Ab were done by Elizabeth Fowler and Peter Fowler when he was, that was later, Charles Thomas, sorry, initially. I think I said Peter Fowler earlier. I get muddled up because they wrote it up. They were actually site supervisors for Charles Thomas, who was supervising it. Yes, sorry, Steve. I said Peter Fowler earlier, but he's very key in what went on here. But it was actually Charles Thomas that did was leading the initial excavations. And the work was done in the late 50s, but it wasn't published until 1988. Which is a bit of a shame, but never mind. Luckily, Charles Thomas had stored all the materials really quite safely, even though it was in his garage, but it was all properly packed away. So that was really helpful. And Ewan Campbell and Adrian Maldonado at Glasgow have managed to get hold of it, and they've gone through and had a good close look at what came out of these. And two of the samples of charcoal that had come out of what they thought was Columba's cell here actually dated to 570 to 640 and 580 to 650. So they could well be, they sort of fit with the time Columba was on there. So because Columba died in 597. So that does look as if it probably was the site of his cell, or the stone with the slot in is a more modern date. Some of the following illustrations are taken from work by Ewan Campbell and his team. The blue on this LiDAR picture from Historic Scotland is the trenches that were done by Charles Thomas and Peter Fowler and various other people in the 50s and 60s, and some of them in the 70s. A lot of them sample trenches and other trenches. And the Glasgow team decided to have another look at this, which goes across the Vallum, and a pit there and one down near the church, which we will look at the results of. Now, this is what I was saying. This is re-excavating Charles Thomas and the Fowler's Trench from the 1956, and at the bottom of it, just above the penny, which was dated 1956, the limit of their excavation, they'd used it to dump all their beer bottles and gin bottles, which I think would be somewhat frowned on these days. But quite amusing to see the way archaeology has changed. But there wasn't any rubbish collection on Iona, so they had to put it somewhere. Anyway, that's where it went. So this is the re-excavation of that trench right the way through. You can see from it that this was 2017. That is basically just an earth bank. That's all it is. There's no real stones or anything in it. It is literally just an earthen bank that goes around to delimit the site. So here's a further one of with some further geophysics results plotted in on it of the ditch and other anomalies that they've found. And one of the things that was interesting, the Glasgow team in particular, was Site B here, just to the south of the Abbey. So we go into that, and they did a ground penetrating radar of that area. This is the Abbey at the top here. And these were the anomalies that they found. And this was a piece of wall that Charles Thomas had found with Peter Fowler back in the late 50s. So they've actually re-excavated this in 2017, and again in 2018 they extended their excavation. And there's a bit of early foundations up against the Abbey wall there that they don't know the date of. There's this curving wall, and there's another curving wall there, but they don't line up with each other, and they don't go anywhere. So at the moment, it's still quite a big puzzle as to what's going on. It's a substantial wall. That's a view of it, with reasonably large, well fitted together stones in the lower courses, and some packing pieces on the top. It's obvious, assuming it's probably been robbed out for building the Abbey and other building purposes by the locals over the years. So in the 17th, 18th centuries probably. So we don't know what it was or how high it would have gone. After Columba's death, the life continued as normal with a succession of abbots until 795, when the first Danish Viking raids occurred around Scotland. And they were raided again in 802, and in 806 another raid resulted in 68 monks being slain. gradually, as time went on, they became less. It was the Danes that were the most violent, rather than the Norwegian Vikings. But gradually, they settled among the islanders, and as in 1200 AD, in fact, the current abbey was, or the forerunner of the current abbey was, as I said earlier, actually built and funded by the Vikings for the Benedictines. And a letter in 1203 is written by Pope Innocent III to Abbot Celestine, the Benedictine Monastery of St. Columba. And it confirms their possession of Iona, Mull, Colonsay, and some of the other islands and churches in the area. And slightly later, the Benedictines also established a nunnery on Iona, although that didn't last very long. I think it was a couple of 100 years. I've rattled on and spoken rather quickly, I think, because I have got other things, but I think I'd be quite happy to open to questions. I suppose before that, I'll just finish up with where it's getting to now. So there's a lot more archaeology that needs to be done probably on Iona, but there's very limited areas where it can be done. There were some early excavations in what's now the cloisters, but they didn't really come up with very much. So we're no wiser, apart from the fact that on Tor Ab, that's the little mound outside the abbey, they found evidence of burning in the sort of 580s, which fits in with Columba sitting up there. There is very little evidence, physical evidence, archaeological evidence of the early monks' life on the island. 1899, the Duke of Argyll gave the abbey to the Trust Church of Scotland, and they restored it. A few years later, he gave some money for restoring it, and the roof was restored. And then George Mcleod in the 1938, as I said earlier, founded the Iona community, and the abbey buildings were built by unemployed craftsmen and others and ministers from Glasgow. And if anybody wants to see it, there's an amazing film called Sermon in Stone, which talks about the rebuilding and how they got the money and the people to actually build it, including during the war, where some shipwrecks occurred, and they got lots of good timber that arrived on the shore of Mull, right opposite Iona, that they used for the buildings. And when I was there and I was responsible for the maintenance, it was extraordinary to see. This is in work done in the 40s and 50s. The roofs were all wooden pegged. There were no screws, metal screws used. All the joints were mortise tenoned and wooden pegged. Absolutely fantastic craftsmanship went in to the restructuring and rebuilding of the abbey. Recently, there's been a big fundraising and it's been renovated. I've not been there since. Apparently, it's a great deal more comfortable than it used to be. Well, I was there. We put in a new, or just after I was part of the planning, we put in a heat pump that extracted water from the Sound of Mull, Sound of Iona, and took heat out of it to heat the abbey, to keep the background level of humidity reasonable, because in the west of Scotland and the islands, the humidity can often be very high. Yeah, that's it really. That's the inside of the Abbey Church. That's the opening of the youth centre. This is George Mcleod, who oversaw the building of the rebuilding of the Abbey, and then we built this Mcleod Centre, and that's Leah Tutu, Desmond Tutu's wife, who came to open it. And Ronald Ferguson, who was the current leader of the Abbey. And that was just put in. That was a helicopter that took my wife away when she was giving birth to my son, and flew her down to Glasgow, thanks to the Royal Air Force. So, questions really?
Okay, thank you very much, Alasdair. That was interesting. I knew nothing about St. Columba, or that there were so many monasteries and so many saints. Well, I knew there were plenty of saints coming from Ireland, but I didn't know there were so many monasteries founded all over the place. I've got a question, which is, why did the Danes kill so many monks? Was it because of, well, why would that be? If they're peacefully sort of praying in their monasteries.
We don't really know. The thoughts are that basically the monks wouldn't say, the Vikings assumed that being a monastery they would have gold and silver, and the monks wouldn't say where their things were buried, and they were effectively tortured and with the hope that they would say where these things were. They may not have had much in the way of gold and silver. I mean, the Irish monasteries were not particularly well off with lots of gold and precious metals. So I think it was after loot rather than actually against the people themselves. And in fact, the Vikings gradually settled in and intermarried, and there's quite a Viking presence in some of the West, particularly in Ireland. So I think it was more about looting and not being given things rather than anything else. We don't know.
It just seems such an odd thing to, but I can see where that's probably is a very feasible explanation, that they sort of worked their way through them. So where's the treasure? Don't know. On to the next one, as it were. But
yeah, that's right. Somebody will crack at some point, and there may well not have been much treasure, or at least not treasure in the sense that the Vikings who liked gold and silver, the monks' treasure, they often had relics, of other saints and things that weren't particularly valuable in terms of monetary value, but they were valuable in terms of religious value. And of course, I don't think the Vikings thought a great deal of those.
I also made a note that St. Oran's message to Columba must have been a real blow, given the teachings of Christian church, that there was no heaven or hell.
Yes, it must. I don't know how true the story is, but it is quite a widespread story, and in Ireland there's a saying: if somebody gives you unsavoury truths, of go and put mud in his mouth or in her mouth, and it comes from putting mud in the mouth of St. Oran, apparently, who was giving a message that Columba didn't like. So the story goes. But it's interesting that sorry, I rattled through it a bit. And I had got other things I could have said. I was trying to make sure I didn't run out of time. But it was clear to me that yes, he was trying to promote Christianity because it was seen as a they were. I think everybody was pretty fed up with all the fighting. The battles were going on year after year, month after month, and there were a lot of petty kings and petty kingdoms. And when you look at the kings of Ireland, or even those kings that are buried, if I go to scroll back up here to the Villa, and here we go. If you look at the kings down here, 858, 862, 877, 878, 889, 900. You can see how violent and changing it was.
Yeah.
There wasn't any great stability. I said one out of order there. Constantine's out of order, I see. Constantine first is duplicated for some reason. My mistake. But it was really a violent time, and the idea was that Christianity would come and form a more passive society, and it did, of course, in the end. And the Picts were converted. Columba went up and tried to convert the Picts and had some success, and then Kenneth MacAlpin in 858 was the first, which is over here, was the first true king of all of Scotland. And it was partly by marriage. He basically married a Pictish queen, as it were, and so at that point Scotland became a sort of united united Scotland for the first time. And but even then there was still a lot of infighting as to who would take over, resulting, I think, from all the petty kingdoms that and jealousies as to whose son and whose daughter would get the next kingship, as it were. Scotland came from the Scotti, and the Romans actually gave the term Scotti as Irish pirates that were attacking the mainland from Ireland, and that's where apparently the term Scotti came from, and that was where eventually the term Scotland came from. Apparently, there is another slightly apocryphal story of a Egyptian princess coming up and being involved in that, but I think there's not a great deal of backup to that one. But so Scotland effectively came from Dalriada in the west. But even Dalriada, the head of Dalriada, where Aidan was crowned, was a place called Dunad, which is just a hillock on the Mull of Kintyre, and it is just a hill. There's really nothing much found there. There's a rock with a so-called footprint in it that the king had to put his foot into before he was ordained. But there was nothing in the way of what we would modernly think of as buildings and kingly royal estates. I mean, you must know from what your past history, Steve, but it's quite difficult to think back to actually how people lived, even in relatively recent times, in remote areas.
Yes.
You know, even if you go back to the sort of 1700s in the west of Scotland, people were living in what we'd now consider absolute hovels. So it sounds very impressive, all these kings and so on, but basically they were clans and local families fighting for their bit of turf and their betterment.
Right. One other question has come in from Kevin, which says, Columba is often credited with spreading Christianity in Scotland. Did he or his monks travel?
Yes, they travelled, well, particularly into northern England. It was quite a big issue. Basically, Lindisfarne, Holy Island, was a Columban monastery. They did have quite a lot of offspring monasteries across Scotland and northern England. And they had a different tonsure from most monks, and they celebrated Easter and Christmas differently. And I think it was about the 7th or 8th century, at the time of Aidan, a different Aidan who went to Lindisfarne, and the Eastern and Western churches had a big sort of heave ho, and the Roman Church won. And the Celtic Church basically had to knuckle down and adopt the dates and more of the styles of the Roman Church that had come up from Augustine in the south,
Right.
rather than Patrick in the west. So yes, they did. And there's still, I mean, it's sort of been a bit of a renaissance. There's quite a lot of Christians that like some of the Celtic attributes, which they seem as more ecological than some of the Roman ones.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions for our speaker? It's not looking like there are. I'll just whip through and see if there's anybody wanting to say anything. No, I don't think there are. In that case, I will thank you very much for giving us that interesting talk, Alasdair. And oh, hang on, there is one. It says, it's from Susanna Bedford, who says, heave ho equals Synod of Whitby was 664.
Right, thank you. Yes, I couldn't remember the date. Yes, that was when it all happened. This between Celtic Church and the Roman Church. And basically the Celtic Church lost.
Right.
Okay. So thank you very much for that. Yes, I'd forgotten the date.
Right. Well, thank you very much for talking to us. It's something that could not have happened without technology, and because getting you down to do so would have been prohibitively expensive, but it's nice that we have been able to get you and come to talk to us via this medium. Just before we go, can I just tell you about our next meeting? Not you necessarily, Alasdair, but the members. It's scheduled for Monday, the 21st of February, when we very much hope that we would be able to meet in the Methodist Church. Only time and the government will tell. All being well, our speaker, David Ingham, will join us there to tell us about Iron Age and Anglo-Saxon activity in Soham, a Roman roadside settlement in Fenstanton, and an Anglo-Saxon cemetery in Cambridge. So I think plenty of him to sort of tell us there, and I look forward to seeing you there in person on that day. Until then, good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you for listening.
Good night.
Good night. See you, Alasdair.
Bye
All right.
now.
Okay, bye
Bye.
everybody.